St. Joseph's Hospital. Stop working on that nigger and let him die. Treatment and death, why does this place exist? For treatment, mercy, and caring. Here, wrongdoing should desist, and love prevail, however daring. Defile the oath and honor too. The evil stalker was afoot, with death the object of his woo, and held the source of his root. Death, he declares to all about, was the goal sought that night. Death was all they ever sought, to end the hated prophet's light. So, alive but near death, he lay there, his mortality at the mercy of the haters, denied all necessary minimal care. Death's feast had its own deadly waiters. Martin Luther King Jr. was struck by a single shot around 6:01 p.m. on Thursday, April 4, 1968, as he stood on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. Ralph Abernathy, who started to walk out of room 306 with Dr. King, seemingly remembered that he had forgotten to put on aftershave lotion, turned around, and went back in to correct this omission. That was where he was when the shot rang out. Billy Kiles, who had knocked on the door about 10 minutes earlier and, contrary to his claim ever since that fateful day, was told by MPD surveillance officer Willie B. Richmond not to go into the room, walk away from the door, and go down the balcony and wait some 50 to 60 feet north of room 306. Quite curiously, at least from my perspective, he remained at that distance when Dr. King came out of the room around 6 p.m., making no effort to come over and join him as he chatted with friends and colleagues in the parking lot below. Following the shot, a fire department ambulance answered the call and roared into the Lorraine parking lot only minutes later. Ernestine Campbell drove from where she had stopped in front of the Mulberry Street entrance to the motel, to be followed by Memphis Yellow Cab number 52, driven by Buddy. It was Buddy who, immediately after the shooting, told his dispatcher that he saw a man jump down from the wall, run north on Mulberry Street, and get into a car, which he thought was an MPD traffic car on the corner of Mulberry and Hewling Streets. No one noticed a lady sitting in a Chevrolet Nova parked on the west side of Mulberry about 20 to 30 feet north of the entrance to the motel. Neither did anyone report seeing a small Honda motorcycle go north on Mulberry and follow the fleeing man who had come down over the wall and the car he entered. As unnoticed was Lloyd Jowers running into his kitchen through the back door and past a startled Betty Spates, while another man ran from the bushes back toward the rooming house, entering the alleyway between the two wings of the building, leaving size 13 footprints in the mud as he entered the basement that had doors to another alley leading to Hewling Street and to the green Chevrolet parked on the south side of Hewling. Equally unnoticed was a hasty withdrawal of military sniper teams on the roof of the Illinois Central Railroad Station and a water tower set back from the motel, and the descent of two PSYOPs Army photographers from the roof of Fire Station number 2. With all these events going on in close proximity, the ambulance carrying the wounded Dr. King, Dr. Abernathy, and Bernard Lee set out for St. Joseph's Hospital at approximately 6:10 p.m. Some 5 minutes later, it arrived at the hospital, and Dr. King, still breathing and alive, was carried into the emergency room just after 6:15 p.m., where one would expect that work would begin in a frantic effort to save his life. What has never been satisfactorily explained, or perhaps even revealed until now, was the large presence of military intelligence officers who had taken up positions in the hospital well before the shot was fired. According to Dr. Causeway, who was on duty at the time, the military intelligence officers knew the names of all of the emergency room nurses and doctors on duty. He observed that no consideration was given to moving the critically injured victim to the operating room, and he saw no surgical effort being made to save him. When he inquired about treatment, he was told that he was being treated. Another person on duty in the emergency room that evening was 32-year-old surgical aide Lula Mae Shelby, who had worked at the hospital since 1964 or 1965. Her son, Johnson Shelby, who at the time was 9 years old, almost 10, told me, and subsequently confirmed under oath, see Appendix N for a transcript of his deposition, that she was not allowed to go home that evening or even call home. His family, consisting of his 3 brothers and 2 older brothers of his mother, lived in what was then a duplex house at Nedra and Rice Streets. In 2013, Johnson called Memphis radio station WPLX, hosted by Thaddeus Matthews, to tell his mother's story. My longtime Memphis street friend, Jackie Smith, called me and facilitated my contact with him. Johnson said that when his mother arrived home the next morning, April 5, just before 11 a.m., she gathered the family in the living room to tell them what had happened. She was devastated and very hurt. He remembered clearly that she said, "I can't believe they took his life." At first glance, what a strange statement. She recalled that there were many MPD officers and Army people milling about, in addition to men in suits. She said that she was bringing medical instruments in and out of the emergency room, which was her job, where Dr. King was lying on a bloodied gurney. She saw the huge hole in the lower left side of his face, but heard one of the ER doctors say that he had a pulse. The ER doctors had performed a tracheotomy and inserted a breathing tube. She said that in a while, the head of surgery, who appears to have been Dr. Breen Bland, the Atkins family doctor and collaborator discussed earlier, came into the emergency room with a couple of men in suits and shouted at the staff working on Dr. King, "Stop working on the nigger and let him die. Now, all of you, get out of here right now. Everybody, get out." Johnson said that his mother told them, as she was leaving, she heard 3 sounds of the men gathering or sucking up saliva in their mouths, and then she heard 2 or 3 spitting sounds. This caused her, on the way out, to glance back over her shoulder and see that the breathing tube had been removed, and Dr. Bland put a pillow on and over the face of Dr. King. She said that she believed that he was still alive, however barely. Without a doubt, if he was alive, as he appeared to be, he would have been suffocated. Johnson Shelby repeated his full recollection of his mother's heartfelt disclosures under oath in a deposition I took of him in July 2014. See Appendix N. At an earlier point, as noted above, one of the doctors on the scene, Dr. Causeway, told me that he had asked the neurosurgeon, Dr. Gioia, why he was not taking Dr. King to the operating room for treatment. He said that he was told that he was being treated. In fact, he was being allowed to die. Dr. Causeway said he was shocked that no major surgical effort was made to save him. Ron Atkins Tyler, under oath, told me that Dr. Breen Bland, who, remember, was also the Atkins family doctor, was in fact the head surgeon at the hospital. His medical office was about 50 yards from the hospital. He said he was present and overheard conversations between his father and Dr. Bland, and then, following his father's death, between his brother, Russell Jr., Police and Fire Director Frank Holloman, and Dr. Bland about the importance of Dr. King being taken to St. Joseph's if he was still alive. Ron recalls that Dr. Bland was prepared to give him a certain lethal injection if it became necessary. He said that the last conversation took place around the middle of March 1968, just weeks before the assassination. From what Johnson Shelby recalls his mother saying, the removal of the breathing tube and the use of the pillow replaced the fatal injection. Ron Atkins Tyler has no doubt that they were determined to make certain that Dr. King would never leave the emergency room at St. Joseph's Hospital alive. Though he did not know the details of the final cause of death, it appears that he was correct. Johnson said his mother joined in a strike at the hospital. Staff were seeking to unionize sometime after the assassination and never returned there to work. I made an effort to speak with any of the medical personnel who were named as having been, at one time or another, in the emergency room or the area around the room. The list included Doctors Jerome Barrasso, John Reeser, Rufus Brown, Julian Fleming, and Joe Wilhite. Barrasso, Reeser, Brown, and Fleming had passed away. Some years ago, I managed to have a conversation with Dr. Fleming, an internist who was called in. He confirmed the extensive military presence in the hospital, but remembered little else. Dr. Reeser's son, John, also a doctor, remembered the event but said that his father never talked to the family about it, and so he had no information. Dr. Wilhite very kindly called me back, and though his memory was sketchy, he confirmed that he had for a time been in the ER. He noted that most of the emergency work was done by Doctors Barrasso and Brown. He believed that Dr. Barrasso performed the tracheotomy. He did not recall any intervention, but said that he believed that Dr. Bland may have looked in at one point. He also recalled that, at least for a time, Ralph Abernathy was in the room sitting quietly in the corner. He was not able to be specific about the movements of the medical team, but did recall the presence of considerable numbers of MPD officers who locked down the hospital. Unlike Dr. Causeway, who was specific about their presence and degree of knowledge about the staff on duty, he strangely did not recall the military presence. After our conversation, Dr. Wilhite somewhat nervously called me back and asked me to give him a note that would justify him having spoken to me about that event. As counsel to the King family in the civil action, which judgment had been renewed, I agreed to do so, as we were still in a post-judgment discovery process allowed under Tennessee law. I also managed to speak with 87-year-old Dr. Dorothy Bryant, Lula Mae Shelby's cousin. She was on staff at St. Joseph's Hospital, but off on that evening. Johnson Shelby thought that his mother might have mentioned her observation to her. He said that she might be afraid that her pension, her sole means of support, might be in danger if she revealed anything, but I engaged her. She claimed that she did not know or remember anything, and she said that they were all told not to say anything or their jobs would be lost. Shortly afterward, she simply hung up the phone. The sadness arises in the possibility that, of at least 5 medical doctors, each one of whom became prominent and respected practicing physicians in Memphis, Shelby County, in the state of Tennessee, none saw or heard anything untoward taking place in the St. Joseph's emergency room on the evening of April 4, 1968. Perhaps there was nothing, no violation of the criminal law or their medical ethics that took place. Then again, perhaps one or another were simply not in a position at the time to see or hear the acts Lula Mae Shelby recounted the morning after, that also appear to have credibility based on the planning conversation Ron Tyler Atkins overheard some weeks prior involving the Atkins family doctor, Breen Bland. I forwarded a copy of the autopsy report to Dr. Cyril Wecht, one of the world's leading forensic pathologists, along with 2 queries. Could Dr. King have conceivably survived that wound? If he could have survived, what would have been his physical and mental condition? Dr. Wecht responded that he does not believe that Dr. King would have survived, but there was no way that the doctors on the scene could have known about the severity of the wound, and the ER doctors seemed to have been doing all they could to save him. This was what was happening when Bland, who also could not have known about the severity of the wound, ordered them to stop working and leave the ER. See Appendix O for a copy of my request to Dr. Wecht, along with a copy of the autopsy report and Dr. Wecht's response. Dr. Wecht's opinion was based upon his reading of the autopsy report prepared by medical examiner Dr. Jerry Francisco. Dr. Francisco reported that he found that Dr. King's spinal cord had been severed, and that there were several arterial lacerations caused by the fatal bullet that re-entered the neck and proceeded downward into the spinal area before becoming lodged in his back. According to the King HSCA panel, the medical examiner, Dr. Jerry Francisco, confirmed that he did not trace the full track of the bullet, explaining that he believed to do so would require unnecessary mutilation of the body. The decision resulted in some significant ramifications. According to the HSCA medical panel, it mitigated against a more precise ascertaining of the origin of the shot. I find this very curious because in his testimony at the 1999 civil trial, some 21 years later, when I asked him if he had traced the path of the bullet from entry to its lodging in Dr. King's back, Dr. Francisco contended that he did conduct the tracing procedure. Whether this was in reaction to the earlier criticism and an effort to mitigate against the earlier, closer to the event admission and cover up that failure is, of course, uncertain, but obviously worrying. Perhaps more importantly, according to the testimony of Dr. Michael Baden, the medical examiner of New York City who headed the panel, on the basis of the medical information they had, including x-rays and notes of the ER doctors, they could not confirm that Dr. King's spinal cord had been severed. Neither could they conclude specifically the blood tissue or arterial damage. Also, the names of 2 examiners were on the autopsy report, Dr. Francisco and Dr. Sprunt. In fact, Dr. Sprunt was not present. Dr. Francisco performed the autopsy on his own. Dr. Sprunt was the head of the pathology department of St. Joseph's Hospital and had no official connection with the medical examiner's office. It was explained that his name was routinely added to some autopsy reports.